What does it mean to be human? And how can I live my life in a way that brings me true, lasting happiness? These questions are the biggest things we're going to seek to answer in this special episode of Spirit Spire, starting right now.
Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit Spire. And now, here is your host.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Spirit Spire. I'm your host, John Sohl. With me is my co-host, Isaac Fox.
Hello.
Bryan and Erik could not be here with us today, so we're very excited. This is our first time really digging into a very age-old question. The question is, what is man? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a man or a woman? Right? How can we live our lives in a way that brings us true happiness? And so I'm very excited to be with Isaac, to have this great conversation.
Excited to be here.
I have my way of coming about things. You know, I love John Paul II. I grew up with him. I mean, we all did, right? I think Isaac has a special connection to St. Thomas Aquinas. Would you want to give a little bit of background about how that came about?
Well, I mean, St. Thomas really he's kind of my hero. He's my guy. I just have an interest, a very amateur interest in certain aspects of like philosophy and so forth that I would just kind of describe myself as a Thomist, but like in a really, really amateur way. And I think for a fairly long period of time, a lot of Thomas's work kind of got put on the back burner, so to speak. And you can probably remember this better historically. Was it Pope Pius X that pushed for a renewal of Thomistic theology?
I think it's possible, yeah.
I think it was one of the Piuses around.
When you think
time.
about it, it's so dense, so intense.
It really is.
That I don't necessarily blame anybody for being so overwhelmed. We were like, let's kind of chill for a little while.
Yeah.
But yes.
And part of that challenge is based on the fact that Thomas is not only brilliant, but he's using scholastic terminology. And so these are either words we're not familiar with anymore, or we use different definitions of the same word now. So, you know, I can look at a paragraph of St. Thomas and I think, I have no idea what he means. But it's interesting with this renewal of Thomism, particularly in the Dominican order, but in other Catholic philosophers and thinkers over the last century. It's really amazing to realize in these big, deep issues that affect us in theology, in philosophy, in anthropology, this guy from, 8 centuries ago, he seems to just keep getting the answer right. And I find the more I learn about Thomism, the more fascinating it is. So I got a special place in my heart for St. Thomas.
No, I definitely have a small connection to him as well, because when I was in high school and early college, I went to an awesome youth conference here in Louisville called Ignite Your Torch.
Okay.
And it introduced me to what they call the angelic warfare confraternity.
Yes.
And it was kind of inspired from St. Thomas Aquinas' life and legacy.
Right.
He didn't found it himself per se, but maybe he had a little bit of a say in that from heaven.
Correct.
Right? But some sort of influence as he prayed for everyone. And he continues to, just like John Paul II and all the saints, right? I look at my grandma as someone who prays for me. You know, I'm not going to make a statue of her, right? But it's this desire to have a connection with the people who have gone before us, who have lived holy, challenging, courageous lives, with all the desires and feelings and stress and suffering that we experience. But by God's grace, they were able to live these lives and leave the legacy that we can now follow, right? And so angelic warfare to me was about, warfare, right? How do we face temptation toward all kinds of the things the world offers us in a way with confidence, and even when we fail and fall short, we still rely on God's love, His mercy, to pick us back up, dust us off, and help us carry on in the journey, right?
And kind of if our viewers or listeners are not familiar with it, the angelic warfare confraternity is really interesting because the name would indicate that it's something to do with spiritual warfare.
Right.
But it's actually about sexual purity. It's about chastity.
Yeah.
That's the goal of it. And the story behind it is that St. Thomas, according to tradition, I'm sure you know the story, but I'll just go ahead and say it again quickly.
Yeah, tell the story. I love it.
He was, and you probably know it better than me, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but he was very interested in joining the, at time, very new Dominican order.
Right. And they weren't as wealthy as the Benedictines.
Correct,
right?
correct.
And that was one of the big things.
I think his family was like, if you have a vocation to the religious life, you're going to be in this wealthier order. You're not going to be one of these poor friars walking around. And so he ended up, kind of a process of events, being locked in some room in his house, basically a prisoner of his family. And the story goes, and I think this is an accurate story, that it was his older brothers, perhaps, I believe.
Yeah, it was his brothers who didn't want him to join the Dominicans.
So they thought they would use temptation as a way to keep him away from
First off, they locked him up in the tower of their family castle, I think, their home manor. And so very loving thing for a family to do for their brother. Who, I don't want you to go to this college. I'm locking you in your room. Like,
Isn't it funny, though? Wouldn't you would think usually if somebody's going to go do something bad, it's an extreme reaction. But you could think, oh, don't do that. And we're going to try to keep you from doing that. But here, he wants to be like holy and give his life to God. And they're like, we have other plans.
Right. And so this is where everything changed, because he's locked away and praying and wondering, what is, God's will for my life? How can I actually follow his will, even despite the pain of all of my family's objections to this deep calling in my life? And so he's praying and waiting. And what do his brothers do but send him temptation in the form of
They introduce a prostitute into his room.
A woman of the night.
Yeah.
And
he, of course, kicks her out promptly, slams the door, and I think...
he didn't just kick her out. He grabbed a hot fire poker from the fire and chased her out with, like screaming at her. It was crazy.
And then took it and with the charred end when the door slammed the door and made the sign of the cross on the back of the door. So that's the story.
After the lady escaped. Right?
Yes. That's the story. That is, as far as anybody knows, completely true story. The bit that kind of happens after that, there is this tradition, and this was something I learned more recently, so I don't know if it's something Thomas himself shared, but that is that he then had this miraculous experience of two angels coming and girding him, tying him around the waist with this belt that was a symbol of chastity and purity. And so what I find really fascinating about this is we think of Thomas now as the big brain, right? This sort of devotion to him starts very early after his life, where that belt became a relic, that rope, really.
Yes, people still have that today, I think.
Yes,
right?
And people would go and touch it, and they would pray to him for assistance with purity. So he has this very early devotion or following on matters of chastity and sexual purity. And it's just kind of interesting to me now, because I think it's kind of gotten forgotten.
It has.
And there are people...
Meaning he was human. He had desires, he had feelings, he had dreams and emotions, he had temptations.
Of him as patron saint of students, patron saint of maybe philosophers or whatever. But he has a real patronage of sexual purity.
Yeah.
And there's those who have felt those two things kind of go together. I mean, God can do anything, but it seems that his mind was freed from those distractions, and that probably helped him be more open to the high thoughts that he had. So you and I are both members of the Angelic Warfare Confraternity. I joined last year under the advice of my spiritual director, Father Bryan Timothy, who's a Dominican.
Yeah. See, I joined in 2011 when I was at the Ignite Your Torch Youth Conference. And I actually, they give you a medal and you can pray with it, and you have prayers that you pray every day. They also give you a chastity cord that you can wear if you want. Not everyone does.
It's optional.
I chose to do it for a period of time in my life. I found it was not helpful for me or necessarily as healthy as I thought it was when I first tried it, right? It was maybe a powerful moment of courage that I felt I needed at that time in my life, and I'm not going to fault my younger self for that, but I'm not going to say that's a universal rule. Everybody should give it a try, even, because it might actually do more damage because of someone's psychological, emotional, spiritual, or even sexual past.
Sure.
You know, some of the deep layers that might get them to hyper focus on sexuality. It might get them to be overly scrupulous, meaning obsessive about their behavior, their feelings, their thoughts even, and that can be somewhat detrimental to the health and well-being of their personhood. But at the same time, sometimes that's the very step they need to take. Some people need that courage, and they can handle it. God gives everyone different gifts and different reasons.
It's kind of like making a big statement, and natural material things can do that. It's like, you know, maybe if you're going to join a monastic order, and when you're clothed in the robe, yes, you'll still experience temptation, but you're making this really strong statement. And it could be the same way of using the cord to tie around, you know, as a belt. But I would kind of give a shout out about the angelic warfare confraternity. This is such a big thing, because pretty much no one doesn't deal with temptation, right? It doesn't matter if you're single, it doesn't matter if you're married, it doesn't matter if you're young, it doesn't matter if you're old. And sometimes, like, again, as you said, we don't want to hyper focus and become scrupulous about things that could make it worse.
Right.
But I think it is very good to remember that it is always a good idea to say some prayers about this, because temptation is going to happen.
And they're powerful, powerful
Very
prayers.
powerful. Yeah,
yes.
Very powerful.
I think one of the most powerful parts of this, you know, I think it's amazing that we're starting with Thomas Aquinas and the angelic warfare confraternity when we launch into this deep question, right? What is man? What does it mean to be human?
Because we're going to get back to JPII here in a minute.
Oh yeah. But I love this story, this very unknown story of Thomas Aquinas, because you're right. Everyone thinks he's an intellect, and he is, but he's so much more.
Correct.
He is a human person with a heart, a body, a soul, deep desires for happiness. And like you had said in an earlier episode, he had this mystical experience where he actually saw heaven, got a glimpse of it, and said, everything I've written is straw, meaning pretty much useless. He was trying to actually encourage people to burn his writings. Not that they did that, right?
He is not some kind of dry intellect. He had mystical experiences. He wrote poetry. He wrote hymns that we use.
Yeah, he was passionate.
Yeah, he was a very human person.
Right, and I think we can give him a greater name in the Catholic world, the Christian world, by sharing that story, because of the nature of not just its mysticism. My gosh, she had a vision of angels. I mean, I think of my mom. She had the vision of angels, right? And that changed my life. Remember, my parents got married on the Feast of the Guardian Angels.
I remember you talking about this, yes.
I mean, the amazing things that happen when angels and saints get involved based on God's will, right? He's really encouraging us to, you know, connect with our guardian angels, to connect with the saints who've gone before us, and trust that we can be in heaven as well. We can be part of that big story. And so this story of Thomas Aquinas having this experience is like tapping into the gift of the Holy Spirit of wonder and awe, of this deep encounter with the mystery of God, where he was just dumbfounded, awestruck, amazed at the love that God would show him and the strength that God would give him so that he could encounter his truest self, his deepest desires for flourishing, which obviously he shared very clearly in the written word.
Right.
What a gift, right? My goodness. And so I think Thomas Aquinas is maybe the perfect stage to set because he does help us tap into that gift of wonder and awe. And especially when it comes to John Paul II and his theology of the body, it all goes back to Genesis.
Correct.
You know, the gift of Adam and Eve and their call that God gave them in the original plan that he has for each person. That call is something that I think will take many, many weeks, months, years, certainly episodes.
So we can't get through the whole theology of the body in one episode. No, that's not going to happen.
No, we definitely will not be getting
we won't get through it in 100, probably.
No, it's going to take so much time. Theology of the body is not just a collection of audiences that John Paul II gave on Wednesdays in the 70s and 80s.
Sure.
He himself says in the text that it's so dense, it transcends anything he could fully write about it. And yet he still articulated it in such a way, especially for our times, to help us understand the depth of our humanity, our purpose, our deep desire for a healthy, happy, normal lifestyle,
Sure.
right? And so that's why I think we need to spend some extra special time together, just breaking these open. You know, my hope is to really go on some level audience by audience, at least
That
per
would be great.
segment, right? It's a lot of
Right.
work, but we'll get there.
Well, I think also it's one of those things where no matter how many episodes it takes, that's actually great, in my opinion, because it's a topic that is so awesome, so deep, so exciting to talk about, and that I love, that I'm like, yeah, let this go on for years. I'm fine with that, because it's just like going deeper and deeper into a beautiful ocean, right? It's not like you're trudging through a boring textbook.
No, it is not. And I think what you're saying, the excitement and adventure of delving into these conversations is, I think, what sparked my interest, you know,
Right.
all those years ago when I read The Good News About Sex and Marriage and books like Theology of the Body for Beginners, like delving into, oh my gosh, this is everything I've been looking for. This
Right.
answers my questions that everyone has. So I have a feeling that everyone in our audience will also get a deep sense of, yeah, I want to hear about that.
Right.
That's what I need in my life.
And one point that I would make too right here at the beginning is when we think of theology of the body or hear the term, this is not just about the body, and it's not even just about human sexuality, though that's very, very important. Fundamentally, this is an answer to the question you asked right at the beginning. What does it mean to be a human person?
Yes.
And so, you know, kind of thinking about this, that is a huge question. What is a human person? What does it mean to be human? It seems to me there's kind of two things here that are worth thinking about. One is, why is that question important? And then, of course, why is John Paul II's work an important answer? In other words, throughout history, we've all had different viewpoints about what does it mean to be human. We have seen man and woman in different lights, so to speak. And sometimes we get really far off base with that, and that has resulted in very tragic consequences. So,
well, I think those consequences and perhaps darkness is something that maybe we need to spend some time with. You know,
Yeah.
I was a little like, gosh, I don't want to get dark too quick, but yet at the same time, I don't think we have. I think what we're
No.
doing right here is laying the groundwork, because we want to start with hope and joy
Sure.
and peace. And, you know, Thomas Aquinas and his vision touching, you know, my own family story, your story, all of our stories going back to Genesis, gives us that sense of wonder and awe, adventure, a desire to, okay, let's address some difficult stuff. Let's at least get a sense of, okay, where are we right now, so that we can go back and delve into the depths of
Right.
what John Paul II really gave to us for such a time as this.
It's
You know?
not accidental that he did this. There's always a reason behind God's timing.
Yes.
That such a great pope, such a brilliant man, such a holy man, in that period of human history would spend so much time focusing on this question. What does it mean to be human? How do we understand our bodies? How do we understand our relationships? How is the image of God expressed through the human person, you know, made in the imago Dei, in the image of God? So yeah, I think that would probably be worthwhile, is to say at the start, where are some of the ways in which throughout history we as humans have gone astray in our thinking, you know, in which we have misunderstood what it means to be human, and why then that helps us see why the teaching of John Paul II is such an important antidote
Yes.
to those problems.
Yes. And I think it's a perfect place to really pause and reflect on, because, you know, if we want to delve into those weeds, I think we need a little bit of time. So for now, let's
And coffee, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, and
Or it's
coffee
actually- it's
refill.
water in
For me,
here,
it's
but-
water, right? I'm not a coffee guy. I usually take let's say I do hot chocolate, something like that. So eventually I'll have some hot chocolate for everyone. But at
now
least,
that we know this, we're all going to make fun of you for drinking hot chocolate.
forever. I don't even care. It's good stuff. Good stuff. Deal with it. But with that, everyone, I think we will pause for this segment, and we'll pick things back up as we prepare to enter into some of the things that maybe we've all experienced in our lives and society, so that we can, first celebrate what's right, so we can then find the energy to fix what's wrong. So with that, we'll see you in our next segment. Hey everyone, this week's episode is sponsored by Family Renewal Project. FRP is a local theology of the body apostolate in service to the Archdiocese of Louisville. They're dedicated to renewing the culture through the renewal of the family. They have so many amazing things going on, so check them out at familyrenewalproject.com. Welcome back to Spirit and Spire. I'm your host today, John Sohl. This is a special episode here with my co-host Isaac Fox. Bryan and Erik, of course, couldn't be with us today, but we've been talking about the beauty of John Paul II's theology of the body as it answers the deepest, perhaps one of the most fundamental questions in life: what does it mean to be human? And how can we live our life in a way that brings us true happiness? Right? We started with St. Thomas Aquinas, right, and his mystical vision of angels girding him with a cord of chastity so that he could run the good race, right, fight the good fight. And he's not just an intellect, but a human being with passion and energy. And how that taps into the gift of wonder and awe, being amazed at God's love, at all of creation around us, so that we can go back to our origins in the Garden of Eden, where that original solitude and unity and vulnerability that Adam and Eve may have had with each other, and that maybe we have somewhat lost. And yet we still have perhaps the echoes of Eden within all of us, right? Yeah. But in order to not just reclaim as if to go back in time, but to move forward, having processed how we've lost it and how we can untwist these lies, perhaps we need to talk about some of these lies. Sure. Get into the darkness a little bit, not in a way that is too shocking or overwhelming, right, but I think in a way that at least gets us all on the same page, so we can have a shared experience of seriousness, of maturity, and of compassion, because darkness that we all face is something that is very personal. And I think many times when we are struggling with sin or pain, we have a tendency to feel like that darkness is me. Right. Is who I am.
We identify that. It becomes a self-identity. We identify with ourselves, which can also lead to self-hatred, because then you're seeing yourself as being dark, as being messed up, as being whatever it might be. And that can have really tragic consequences. Right. Yeah.
So I would ask, Isaac, what would you say some of the perhaps big things that have come about over the last 300, 400 years? I know it sounds like, wow.
This will be a short episode.
Yeah, short episode, everybody, right? A quick history lesson. To me, it's not so much about let's tell the history. It's more about how do we learn his story. The connection between history and his story, to me, makes it less about dates and names that you have to memorize for a test you forget next week.
You can just kind of sketch
it.
Some of the big patterns.
Right. It's not about what you learn in school in history class. It's about understanding the story enough to make sense of it, and then learn how to, let's address some of these issues, untwist some of these lies, so we can move forward as a human race with hope. That's the goal. Absolutely. And so going back 300 or 400 years, I think, would give us a good, solid perspective, so that then we can address the things that have happened in the past 40 or 50 years, right? So what would you think, 15, 16, 1700, somewhere in that range? I mean, what was going on back then, in a general nutshell, I guess?
Well, would you mind if I take just a little bit even broader perspective for a moment?
That's fine.
Because it occurs to me that there are really two questions at stake here. One is, we want to know why it's important to even ask this question, what does it mean to be human, right?
Absolutely.
Right? Is this just a trivial question, or is it something really important? And then, John, in our personal conversations, you've often used the word antidote. When you talk about John Paul II's theology of the body, you say that it's an antidote for many of the ills that we see in society. Well, if you imagine being a doctor and you're trying to prescribe an antidote, you better know what poison is there or you're going to prescribe the wrong one, right? So again, without being too dark or heavy, we do want to look a little bit at not only why the question is important, but what are some of the big errors about the human person that we as a species have gone into over the years.
Right.
And if you're a cat, I kind of like to start there because it seems to me that there are two big ones. There's certainly many, as far as if we step back and think, what does it mean to be human? Well, we could make many errors in answering that, right?
Yes.
But I feel like there's two big ones. And it seems to me the Catholic Church always sort of winds up in the middle of being the balance, right?
Sure.
And so church teaching has always been that man is body and soul, but not like two parts stuck together, right? There's this sort of transcendent unity that makes us truly human. And so if we look at the history of our understanding of ourselves, it seems to me that on one hand, we have a radical dualism, okay, in which you have a belief in soul and body, but they are so separated and so distinct that you wind up with one of two problems. Either they're actually in opposition to each other. There's a fight going on, right? There's this real tension. Mm-hmm. Or else you wind up with the body as being completely unimportant and the soul just kind of trapped in it. It's like a prison and can't wait to get out.
I've heard it called angelism or animalism.
Interesting.
Animalism being your just base instinct, desire, do whatever you want. We're just matter and, whatever you want to do. Whatever you want to do with your body, whatever feels good, do it, right?
Yeah.
Live and let live kind of mentality. Or angelism, where any desire, feelings, bodily functions are uncomfortable, bad, you need to suppress it, be afraid of it, so as to transcend the prison of the body and encounter the divine in some theoretical way that's unhuman and doesn't respect the created world that God made as he said, very good.
Exactly.
Right? And that's the danger between that.
You're putting your finger on the point there that God created it and said it was good.
Right.
So there may be degrees of importance, but it's all good. And I'm glad you mentioned that because let's just go ahead and dig into that for a moment before we look at the alternative. We can go back way more than 300 or 400 years, and we can see this dualism playing out. It appeared very strongly in ancient Gnosticism, which unfortunately also came into the early church and influenced certain parts of it, and we had a number of heresies early on that were Gnostic. And
how would you explain Gnosticism in a brief way?
Gnosticism comes from a Greek word, the Greek gnosis, which means knowledge. We think of agnostic, that would mean like not knowing, right? You're not sure if God
exists or not, right.
But this knowledge, this gnosis of the Gnostics was seen as a special knowledge, right? Almost like a secret religion, and the initiated had some kind of special knowledge.
Okay, gotcha.
And so there was various Gnostic sects around at the time of Christ and before and after. But some of them, even though they weren't Christian, some of those ideas infiltrated early Christianity. And one of the things that we see in that and some other of what we might call early Christian heresies is this really radical dualism, this tension between soul and body, or more fundamentally between spirit and matter. So one of the ideas was that the world, matter, the body, was created by the God of the Old Testament, who actually wasn't God, was something really evil. And it's Jesus, the God of the New Testament, that comes to set us free from that, right? So the result of that, because theology, philosophy, ideas, right, will always affect the way we behave.
Yes.
So you then run to the exact two extremes you just mentioned. You either have, well, the body, being material, is completely unimportant. Let it do whatever it wants to do. It has nothing to do with me being a good or bad person. It doesn't affect my eternal salvation. And so you might have these people indulging in orgies and stuff, right, in some of these various sects.
Very intense things, yeah.
And
sure.
then you have the other side of, well, the body is bad and evil, therefore every single desire of it must be denied at all times. And so you have this intense, strict asceticism.
Which is where you get things like the crucible, the Puritanism, where
Yes.
you burn people at the stake, you strike people off from the book of life, you create this world where...
Are you familiar with the Catharism?
I've not heard of that, no.
Okay, well, because this is the same idea, but it gets a little bit more modern. And actually, we're 17th century here, like you were saying.
Right.
In the south of France, there was a group of, and I'm using the word heresy and heretical. I know it sounds very harsh these days. I'm simply saying not in keeping with the Orthodox traditions of the church.
Right. They just missed the mark. They wanted something good, but they got a little extreme.
And there was
a big time extreme.
Yeah, definite tendency towards of Catharism. Actually, started earlier than that. I want to say.
So
I can't remember the dates, but let's just talk about their philosophy. So, kind of a heretical group in the south of France, heretical Christian group, and they had. I don't know that they had any direct knowledge of the Gnostics, but that old Gnostic heresy crept back in.
Yeah.
And so they had this same kind of intense dualism, and that led to some of the, in more extreme cases, some of the following problems. Fundamentally denying most of the sacraments. Well, of course, because if matter is bad, therefore it would follow that God wouldn't use matter as an instrument or channel of grace. Okay, so this began to become a problem on a political level because they didn't hold to marriage and certain other things. So there was some political tension in how society was structured. They did not, and I don't know if this stemmed directly from the dualism, they didn't accept the sacrament of confession. So after, say if you're a convert or you were born, after baptism, if you commit a grave or mortal sin, you're done for, right? So
that's hopeless.
there are, and I haven't researched this, but I've heard stories that I'm assuming are true, that in some of the more extreme cases, there was kind of like an assisted suicide thing, so you would get to heaven before you committed a big sin, right?
My goodness.
And yeah, so this is like a more modern repeat of this ancient sort of Gnostic dualism. But what you see there is the same kind of thing. We can go to the extreme of asceticism. Everything is bad and evil. The body is just a prison for the soul. Let's escape from it.
Well, I remember...
Or you get like hedonistic delights.
Yes, I remember, and I think people contain both ideologies within them at the same time.
I think so.
And that's where I heard Bryan use this term in another episode, cognitive dissonance, where you hold two beliefs at the same time that are in contradiction to one another. Yeah. And that gets you to a point where you, over time, become somewhat indifferent, jaded, cynical, ignorant, and you're fine with that. And so you no longer
neurotic.
Have a narrative. You don't have a story that you're seeking or you're a part of. So you end up living a life of pure entertainment, indulgence, and
I would say neurotic too, because I think when you hold contradictory ideas, it ends up doing some psychological damage because we can't really do that, right? We can't really truly fundamentally hold opposing ideas. There is, and last little bit on this dualism, there is I believe it is one of the Gnostic Gospels. Maybe somebody can correct me on this, but it's somewhere. There is the idea that Judas was not a traitor, but a hero. And you can see how this ties into the Gnosticism we just discussed, because instead of him being the only one of the apostles who got it wrong, in this story, he's the only one who got it right. And so he sees Jesus as fundamentally trapped in his body. And so his betrayal, quote unquote, was actually he recognized the true spiritual mission of the Messiah, and he was helping to free him from these earthly bonds.
Gosh, that's so
now,
crazy.
That sounds really crazy to us as Catholics, and it is. But you can see, now that we've talked a little bit about Gnosticism and dualism, this tension between, the evils of the flesh and the body and the goodness of spirit. why somebody with that thought who is a Christian would say, well, it doesn't make any sense for Christ to be resurrected with a body, right? We've got to change all of that and rewrite the gospel story.
Yeah, and then that does make sense.
Yeah.
And when you fall into this pattern, whether you're Christian, Catholic, or agnostic, or nothing, right?
Yeah.
It's this, like we have the rising of the nuns in society, but not religious nuns. We're talking about N-O-N-E, people who don't subscribe to any religious affiliation. I'm spiritual, but not religious.
Right.
Meaning I want to have good thoughts about God and have a personal relationship within my mind, but I don't have to necessarily act that out by physically going to church or practicing any prayerful habits in my home, having any religious articles in my home that's visible. And so there's no visible manifestation of this faith that you claim to have in a spiritual sense. And it goes right back to what you're saying with dualism, where you split the body and soul.
That's interesting,
in such a way where, well, it's whatever's in here or in here, but there's no way of proving that or knowing that. And even you who say that I believe this or that, could actually fall into the trap of not really believing that. Just because you think that doesn't mean you're actually going to show that with your own body. You don't even believe at a certain point that you trust God, that you are lovable. And that's the danger. Like, that's why we have confession. Priest says, you're forgiven in the name of Jesus Christ. I absolve you from your sins, right? Through the ministry of his church. It's not meant to be an awkward moment of telling a priest all your dirty little secrets and he's going to go tell everybody. And I had that feeling when I was 10, 12, oh gosh, I want to talk to this random guy who doesn't speak English very well and I'll never see him again. Like, I get that, right? But then there's the reality of trusting that God, Jesus Christ, who was a human being as much as he was a divine being, right? And it's hard to get into this, but it's like this, Jesus wanted us to know through visible, evidential proof that we are loved. Without a doubt. And that's why he gave us the sacraments. And that's why he gave us bodies, so that we would be capable of seeing the invisible reality of our personhood, of the great mystery that is Isaac, that is John. I mean, Jesus Christ knows John Sohl better than John Sohl knows himself, right? And that's kind of terrifying, but fear the Lord.
It's also encouraging.
Oh my gosh, it's so much more encouraging than if I had to be the arbiter, author of my own existence and salvation. Like, that's overwhelming. Like, I would just want to be a little kid running through the fields playing with frogs again. You know, I want mom and dad to just take care of things forever. Don't we all? Right? But yet, I also want to be respected for my maturity and my desire to contribute to the conversation.
There's that cognitive dissonance again.
Right. But not in the same way. Because in this way, I don't feel like it's about going back to original innocence without experience.
We can't.
You can have innocence and experience in this life. Innocence is not ignorance. And that's the great lie that we've been fed.
Did we just say that at the same exact time?
Yes, we did. And so to me, that dualism, that rupture of body and soul, is why I think so many people are fascinated with the macabre, the things that are pretty twisted. I mean, think of why we're scared of skeletons, ghosts, zombies, right? Zombies have no soul, but their bodies, right? Ghosts have no body. Skeletons, what? It's this fear of the lack of humanity, and it's a good thing to be afraid of, because it's a cosmic obscenity. It's not supposed to happen.
It's like, what God has joined together, let no man separate, except we're talking about the human person rather than the human couple there. And so you're right, there's something obscene about that. It's something scary, something weird. Can I just derail here briefly? And first of all, when I said cognitive dissonance, I did not mean in the sense of like that real childhood trust that one should have with God, but I was just saying the fact that I see this in my own life. Sometimes I get really exhausted, and I do think back to childhood days, and I'm like, oh man, I had nothing to worry about, like how great it would be to be a little kid. But then I have the same exact thing of wanting to be, a responsible adult and mature and be, have the experiences I've had. And there is a little bit of dissonance in there.
Right,
and I
just
think
like any kid wants to do. They want to be part of the conversation even if they don't know everything's being talked about, what's going on.
All that gets answered in God. But you said something a moment ago about Jesus and him showing us this love or something. I don't remember how you phrased it. But it made me think of something that I was thinking about earlier today in connection with our conversation. And I know we've just been talking about dualism, and then there's the opposite extreme, which we probably will hit on in a moment. Yeah. But I'm just going to derail briefly here. Whenever we have questions about things, we always go back to the incarnation. Right? You think about theology, you think about the sacraments, and we can focus in on that, but their root is in the incarnation. You find over and over again, we keep coming back to the incarnation. Well, think about the incarnation. You use the word that Jesus shows us the love of God. And show is a very physical thing, right? We see with our eyes. Right. And it occurs to me that if we want to understand the human person, yes, we follow the lead and go back to Genesis, but even more fundamentally, we look at the incarnation. Because the incarnation did two things because it is God and man. It showed to us humans who God is. Because we are not capable of receiving that in the same way, we needed to have it sort of drawn or sketched out for us, right? We need to have it shown to our very own eyes. St. John the Divine in his gospel says this, what our hands handled, right? He speaks of the Word becoming flesh, God becoming man. And then he's like, we actually could touch this with our hands. But at the same time, Jesus was fully human. Yes. But because of the union with the divine Word, one completely free from all sin and all of that. So if we also want to know not only what God is, we should look at Jesus. If we want to know what man is, we need to look at Jesus.
Yes, we do.
So the incarnation really ends up kind of answering all of this.
Yeah, so what you just thought was a derail was actually the center of everything.
Oh, well, there we go.
It all guides us to Jesus in his body, in his divinity, right? Yeah. It's body, blood, soul, and divinity. That's the center, source, and summit of our faith, right? We're thinking of the Eucharist in our lived experience of Catholicism, but the incarnation, the moment Jesus became human, taking on human flesh. That's the greatest gift that we could have ever received. And I think of people who haven't encountered the living Lord in Jesus as a person, as a human, as someone who loves us and we can actually have a relationship with, we can have a dialogue with. When I think of those who have not done so, I have remorse, I have compassion, because I know that. And even those who have encountered him, to some extent, myself included, there's this longing to go deeper, to get to know him more. Right. But especially in light of some of those clear ruptures that we see. Like I remember several years ago, Robin Williams was tragically took his life. And it was a huge public outcry of pain and sadness because he was so beloved by so many. And I remember on Facebook, when you were doom scrolling, back in the early 2010s, I guess, when we were all caught in that web. And some of us still are, but it's...
Guilty.
Right. I occasionally hear. But it's... it was scrolling past a meme, a picture of Aladdin holding up the lamp from Disney, Disney's Aladdin. Remember, Robin Williams was the voice of the genie.
Oh, that's right.
And Aladdin looks at Genie and says, "Genie, you're free." And it was meant to be compassionate. Sure. It was meant to be honoring him as a person and a comedian and an actor, right? And all this stuff. But what it almost screams was, in the taking of his own life, it was his way of escaping, finding freedom.
As if that was a good thing to take his life.
As if it was a good thing to do so. And so that rupture between body and soul, the body is a prison for the soul instead of the means by which our body is animated, and our body is the means by which our soul is expressed, right?
Yeah.
We're both embodied spirits as much as we are spiritualized bodies.
Yeah.
But when you don't understand that and see the human person as a body-soul composite, when you see them as competing forces,
Sure.
right? Go into Karl Marx and the class warfare.
Well,
now it's body versus soul, even.
I was
right?
hoping to get to Marx here in a minute.
Right,
So,
but when you go there, it makes sense that you would see those tragic moments of depression and darkness and his cry for help expressed through suicide as a good thing, something to celebrate. It's tragic. It's something to be sad about.
It's escape rather than healing.
Right.
And the desire for that is understandable because so often we, the way our world may be at this time, healing seems to be far and few between for many people.
Yes.
It is there in Jesus. We need to make that more known. But yes, I would like to say this. When we're talking about God becoming incarnate. I'm a convert, and I remember in the early days of that process, one of the things that you have to look into and think about are the sacraments. And my own personal background, I would say, it was a Protestant form of Christianity, a bit fundamentalist. And I would say it had a little touches of that dualism, right? There was definitely something kind of negative about the body.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in that way of thinking, sacraments wouldn't make any sense. And you find many people that have this question, why would God use matter to convey his grace to us, right? It seems beneath God. And honestly, I can understand that, right? God is so incredibly far above this created universe that we could feel like, yes, that's a bit beneath God.
But how else could we have gotten to know him and really related to him?
That's very true.
And that's the stumbling block, right?
But if we ever run into that question about the sacraments, the answer is the incarnation.
Yes.
Because there's two things. God, number one, was not offended to take on human flesh. He did not shrink from it. It was not this is beneath me, I can't do it. Right. Ew, right? And number two,
he had bodily functions.
Yes, literally. Number two, literally. In the incarnation, our salvation came to us through matter.
Yes.
Okay, the matter itself was not the salvation. It was a channel or instrument of the salvation.
An icon, a sign, right?
But what we say about, receiving grace, the Eucharist, or forgiveness through the sacrament of reconciliation, that is no different kind of language than what the incarnation is. God himself literally had no problems taking on matter and saving us through that.
Yes.
He's already done it. So, of course, he's going to continue to do it the same way.
Over and over. I'm fascinated by that because, there's this desire to really unpack how do we address dualism in a way that helps people untwist those lies? How do we help them not see the body and soul as competing, but as a way that complements and finds union together? Because that, to me, is finding integration, finding your truest self, right? So there isn't rupture, there isn't pain, there isn't divorce or devastation. All of those things are things that we all have within us to some extent, but the reason Christ came was to marry body and soul again. And he did so by marrying divinity with humanity. Because God is perfect union, perfect love, perfect everything. And so for him to enter into this seemingly imperfect and fallen, twisted world, he can't help but untwist it and pick things up and clean things up. And yet he did so by being helpless, being an infant, needing his diapers changed, right? The basic fundamental things. And this is what
he's entered into
can.
every stage of our life
to
redeem it from birth to death.
Right. Remember, he was born as a baby and lived, all we know is of his childhood is up to age 12. And from 12 to 30, he lived a hidden, ordinary, everyday life. With daily chores, daily interactions with his family and friends and community members. And then suddenly at age 30, he starts saying and doing things that are impossible. This is why everyone was saying, isn't he Joseph and Mary's son?
Yeah.
Who is this guy?
Where did this come from?
What are you saying, dude? Like, seriously.
And I know we weren't meaning any of this to be like a Catholic apologetic sort of thing, but also, just one little point there, another thing, not just our belief in the sacraments, but as Catholics, we have this devotion to Mary and trust, reliance on her.
Right.
Never, of course, putting her equal to God. That's all misunderstanding if anybody thinks that. But
True.
Again, let's take our clues from Jesus. Because when Jesus was an infant, even though he was God Almighty, and he completely trusted his mother, he relied on her completely. So not only did he not find it beneath himself to take on, the human body and all of that, but he himself, for some period of time, was utterly dependent on Mary. And he would not have done that. He would not have had that trust had he not made her to be so that he could trust her. So I think we can take that lesson as well and say, hey, if Jesus had no problem laying on the breast of Mary and getting nourishment and trusting her motherly love, I am pretty sure that that's a good idea for us too.
What you nailed is this reality of Jesus trusting humanity, and in so doing, he teaches us how to trust in him.
Yeah.
And it's through that we conquer and untwist the darkness in our lives. And what an incredible example to do so than Mother Mary, right? Yeah. Taking care of Jesus. And in so doing, she's trusting Jesus to guide her to the redemption of humanity, right? Because he entrusts her as the mother of all of humanity, and in ways that we're still trying to unpack. Right?
There's a passage in John where it says something to the effect that he did not trust himself to any man because he knew what was in mankind. So what makes that different than his trusting Mary when he's an infant? He must have made her special.
Right.
Right. We've been talking about dualism, probably due for a break, but what would be the opposite extreme of that?
Yes.
Would be materialism, where we deny the soul altogether. So like in dualism, we're seeing the soul is like trapped in a body, like it's a prison, So like soul good, body bad. And then the opposite extreme would be pure materialism, where there is no soul, there's no spiritual side to humanity at all.
And I think
maybe we'll chat about that in a minute too.
Perfect thing to move forward in our third segment. So we're concluding our second segment here on Spirit and Spire. We've talked a lot about dualism, that rupture of body and soul. And next segment, we're going to get into materialism, which I think we all have experienced an intense taste of. So we'll see you in our next segment here on Spirit and Spire.
Hello everyone, this episode is sponsored by Holy Angels Academy. Holy Angels is an independent school shining the light on the Catholic and classical tradition. With a focus on virtue and holiness, their mission is clear and simple: to help their students attain the end for which they were created, eternal happiness with God. Check them out at holyangelslouisville.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Spirit and Spire. I'm your host, John Sohl, and I'm with my co-host, Isaac Fox, today. It's very exciting. We've been talking a lot about what is man? What does it mean to be human? And how can we live our life in a way that brings true happiness? We know that these are special episodes that will basically take the rest of our lives, probably, to fully adequately answer, right? John Paul II called theology of the body an adequate anthropology. And what he meant by that is adequate was not, oh, it's good enough. And anthropology is the study of what it means to be human. And so adequate anthropology is really not about a good enough study, but the fullest, best, most complete perspective, most adequate perspective of what it means to be human that perhaps we've ever received in the history of the church, in the history of humanity, articulated in such a way that can help us more deeply enter into the great conversation of the human person and human dignity. And we've been talking a lot about, some of the societal problems that we faced over the centuries. Dualism, Gnosticism being, one of the foundational heresies, right? These things that are quite a bit off of the truth of our faith, and the rupture between body and soul, thinking our bodies are prisons holding us back. But I think we're diving into materialism now, and I'm fascinated by what we're going to uncover.
Yeah.
Isaac?
Absolutely. When we're talking about dualism, one of the things we notice is that it's a very old idea. And we just talked a little bit about Gnosticism. We mentioned the Cathars. I would say on a philosophical standpoint, this is worth mentioning. We see a little bit of that rupture happening with one of the most influential philosophers as we begin to approach the modern age. That was, I'm afraid, influential not in a very good way, and that's René Descartes.
Right.
In which we have this idea of the mind almost as like the captain in the driver's seat driving the body around, right? You have this rupture, again, that you're talking about. But, a little while ago, we were talking about how the theology of the body is an antidote to misunderstandings of what it means to be human. And we've spent some time talking about one of those misunderstandings, dualism, which more could be said about. I would say that every religion, every culture, every time, at some point, has dealt with dualism. And it's understandable. When you realize these feelings of callings to something higher, and then you see the sufferings, the sicknesses, the temptations of the body.
Right, who wouldn't want to find deliverance from our problems?
Right, or it's easy to think that, body bad, soul good, to start thinking in those terms, or thinking the two are at war with each other. Certainly the temptations are at war, but the goal is they should be integrated. Right, the war only occurs, at least in Catholic theology, because of fallenness. But there should be no war between soul and body. They should be one beautiful unity, rather.
It's not a redemption from the body. It's a redemption of the body.
Yes, absolutely. So what's on the other side of this? Well, we just mentioned the end of the last segment is materialism. So here we go to the opposite extreme. Here we go to there is no soul. There is nothing but matter.
Right. Gosh.
And this too,
Scary.
I know we often associate this with some modern thought, with more atheistic tendencies. This ain't new either.
No.
We can go all the way back to the pre-Socratic philosophers, the atomists and so forth, and you will find some pretty hardcore materialists there. It's interesting because you and I first started talking about St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
And in Disputed Questions on the De Anima, of the Soul by Aristotle. So he wrote this treatise, these lectures, right? Kind of like answering questions on that. And he responds to those who feel that the soul is like a body, a material organ of some kind. And he points out that he is responding to those which include the ancient philosophers, and he's referring to the pre-Socratic philosophers, right? So even Thomas, some 8 centuries ago, was very aware of how ancient these ideas are.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, right?
Right. So I know you have some thoughts about materialism. I just had a couple of things that
Sure.
I kind of wanted to mention. When we started today's episode, a few segments ago, we talked about how there are 2 big questions. One is, what are some of the errors? What are some of the mistakes we make as we attempt to understand the human person? But also, why is it a big question? Why does it matter? And one aspect of this is, you and I are going to be coming at this from a Catholic perspective. So bottom line, it's about salvation.
Yes.
Right? To understand the human person assists in helping people towards salvation. But I think you can actually take this out of the religious setting and realize historically, when we begin to misunderstand the human person, tragic consequences occur. And there's some extremes. Some are weird, some are tragic. But there have been temptations in modern philosophies to divinize mankind. And then there have been other tendencies which degrade mankind, lowering mankind to level of the animals or perhaps even below, because I think sometimes we treat animals better than humans. And I would just like to point out 2 really big examples. If we take a look at Nazism.
Right, classic.
And I'm not strictly speaking in terms of materialism, but just of how misunderstanding the human person can be so tragic. You're looking at how 2 philosophies that existed not so very long ago, or preceded that by not so very long, the Übermensch of Nietzsche, the idea of man becoming Superman, right? this sort of glorification of some future awesome, man or mankind. Combine that with the survival of the fittest of Darwin, and you come up with somebody who's, presumably a bit mentally imbalanced or worse, that is like, well, the race which should survive is the race that I like. We're going to become the supermen. We're going to rule the world. And not only 6 million Jews died, but let's also not forget about all the other non-Jews who died in the process.
Non-Christians, any political threats, anyone.
Exactly.
Right? Yes.
So here we have this terrible misunderstanding of the human person, its dignity, and instead think that humanity can become something else and only one race matters, right? All of this is completely opposed to a correct understanding of the dignity of the human person made in the image of God. Okay, the other one would be Marxism or communism. And
right, think of what happened with Stalin.
Yes.
My goodness, 6 million Jews, 10 million people in Russia were killed in concentration camps, right? My goodness.
And it goes beyond that to other countries. The tally now is appalling. Two things we see here, and there's a lot more could be said about Marxism, but one is it is completely materialistic. It's completely atheistic. And that's not just the fact that it often tends to be that way. Go back and read Marx and read his predecessors in these lines of thought. It is essential, to their doctrine. So you're looking at complete materialism. So no real soul, no spirit, none of that. But then also you're looking at man in purely an economic light. Now, when we think of economics, when we think of trade and wealth, it's about what we as humans do. So of course humans are going to be a very central part of the focus of that science. But where Marx was a bit different is to really reduce mankind, not to just a player in the economic situation, but to nothing more than just like a function in it, right? Of no more account than my profit and loss sheet or the bale of hay that came out of the haymaker, right?
My gosh, and what does that do but rob us of the ability to be creative? There's no poetry, there's no music, there's no literature, there's no culture.
Yeah.
You lose the very things that give you hope and joy. There's no laughter. Think of, you weren't with us in this episode, but we interviewed Lily Tongue Williams.
Yes,
right?
and I wish I could have been here for that.
What an incredible experience. And the depth of what she encountered in the face of Mao's Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
And the terrible things that took place in communist China, witnessing people dying in the streets. She didn't have television or radio, so it wasn't this distant, desensitized violence that we have, where we just kind of see it and take it for granted.
Yeah, you're seeing it firsthand.
It's firsthand with people that you were talking to perhaps days before. And that's where it ultimately leads. You look at a human person as a cog in the wheel of this grand machine that you're orchestrating, you're in control of.
And your value is no more nor less than your value of being the cog.
Right.
And so if the cog breaks a little, tears a little, gets bent, you throw it away.
Right, is disabled, is in
And
any
so
way
what's
a minority.
we are 105 years now, in about a month, I believe, from the Bolshevist Revolution. And our tally is now between 120 and 150 million worldwide, either outright slaughtered, war, starvation, genocides from Marxism. So this is another tragic example of what happens when we fail to misunderstand the human person. So John, yes, you and I, we want to understand the human person from a Christian perspective. But I think that even if we step outside of religion and look at the history of the world, we can realize that when we start misunderstanding the dignity of the human being, even outside of religion, it's going to lead to catastrophic results. Now, you mentioned St. Thomas. Maybe we'll do this in another episode. We can talk about reasons why he, and others before him, from a philosophical perspective, believed the soul is immaterial, right? That there is something here beside the body. I think those proofs are really hard to get around. They're pretty darn convincing.
Right.
But I would want to say one fun little thing, and then just hear your thoughts on materialism.
Sure.
And I think materialism is very psychologically damaging because you said it really destroys the yearning for the other, the numinous, the higher, the artistic side, all of that. But here's an interesting perspective from St. Thomas. And Thomas, as you know, built a lot of his philosophy on Aristotle. Not as much always as people think. There was some Neoplatonism in there, and there was a lot of just original stuff of his own. And so when he looks at the union of the soul and the body, he does look at it a lot through Aristotle's eyes. But then he has to look at things that Aristotle, who was not a Christian, didn't think about, such as the resurrection.
Right.
And
right. Well, because it hadn't happened yet.
Exactly.
Who would have thought about that? Right?
Well, and I don't mean only the resurrection of Jesus, but just the idea of humans potentially being resurrected in some future time.
Right.
So Thomas has to grapple with these questions of what happens to the human soul after the body is dead, right? And so because it's immaterial, he will go on to say, well, it doesn't die when the body is corrupted. It's going to still exist. So it endures. It's immortal in that sense. But one of the questions that came up, not only, this is a question that's now been around in the church for hundreds of years, is how do we understand that enduring of the soul? Is it simply like a part of ourselves that's kind of like asleep with no real knowledge of anything, floating out there waiting the resurrection? On the other hand, is it this idea, which some people have, of freed from the body, the soul is finally free to be fully human, right? Or is it something else? And there's debate, even among Thomas, about Thomas's precise meaning of things, okay? But there's a side I'm going to fall on. Is that he's a survivalist, which means not only does he think that the soul continues, but that is sufficient to say the human person continues after death, right?
Right.
But even in this most extreme case of what is called survivalism, Thomas will still tell you that the human being doesn't exist until the resurrection. Because by definition, human is rational animal. The animal being the physical bodily side,
right?
The rational being the intellect, the soul, the immaterial side, right? And we're both. If we do not have something that is essential to our definition, we are quite simply not that thing. So he will say, yes, the person, the individual exists after death, but not the human being.
Wow.
Does that make sense? We're missing key component to what it means to be human.
Yes, because it is a cosmic obscenity. The reason dualism is such a problem is because when you separate body and soul, what do you end up with? You end up with death. Right.
Yeah.
Again, go back to the skeletons, the zombies, the ghosts.
Yeah.
They're dead. That's why they have shows called The Walking Dead.
Right,
you know,
the dead shouldn't walk.
They shouldn't that's not how it works. And so death is unnatural, obscene, undesirable. Why do we cry? Why are we sad? Why do we get angry if it's just supposed to happen?
Yeah.
And while you can have peace and hope, the peace and hope comes from the fact that they lived a good life and that they're in a better place and they're happy in heaven and you will see them again one day. Those beliefs stem from Christ and the resurrection.
Right. And
without Christ and the resurrection, none of those happy thoughts or peace can exist.
Yeah.
And you recognizing that, my grandma wouldn't be a human being so much so in this state right now, but her personhood, her individuality still exists
knowing,
and is awaiting, experiencing God in heaven.
But it's
what
still
does that
awaiting
look like?
that full, like, oh, I'm fully human again.
Right.
And that's why the resurrection is so important and so fascinating, because otherwise we kind of be like, well, shouldn't we just hope to be saved and our souls go float around in heaven and they're perfectly happy and fulfilled, right?
Right.
Which I'm not putting that down. The beatific vision is everything. That is what we're striving for. But apparently, we need to be fully human.
Yes.
And we don't know what that looks like. Was it Sunday? You might remember a couple of days ago, the Mass reading was St. Paul, where he is chastising those who have stopped believing in the resurrection. And he's using some very strong language about how important this is. And, he seems to think they're pretty foolish, right?
Yes.
And he makes this comment. And I think, again, the reason we want to escape from the body is because of its current limitations in a fallen world. But he talks about how, like, a seed is sown, and then this plant, grows up from it. The body, he said, is sown corruptible. He's referring to the body being laid in the grave where it will decompose, raised incorruptible.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, it's not going to die again. But if you follow out his analogy, it's also something radically more awesome, because the seed is just this, the plant or flower is magnificent. I think we have no idea what our body is going to be capable of in the resurrection.
Not
we
fully.
have no idea. That just blows my mind to think about sometimes. It's so
And
exciting.
yet we have a glimpse of it, because you think
Christ.
of Christ as
Sends to
well
heaven,
as
walks through
Mother
doors.
Mary.
Yes.
We have both a man and a woman's body in heaven, experiencing the beatific vision of two fully alive human beings, man and woman, male and female, in heaven, within heaven. Because heaven's not just a place, it's a state of being, right? And so they're in some level, a different dimension of being, right?
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is, but yet, so knowing that gives us hope that it is possible, it is going to happen. Mary's a model of our humanity. And I look at St. Joseph on some level.
Yeah.
It's possible, it's possible that he is also in heaven, body and soul.
Yeah.
There's no definitive church teaching, but it has been said it can be worthy of pious belief that St. Joseph is well, because the dead were resurrected at the moment Christ died on the cross, right? The dead walked. So we had a real walking dead, except they weren't dead. They were fully alive. So I can't help but wonder if St. Joseph was among that number.
Yeah.
And could he very well be in heaven? We won't know that fully until we're actually there, experiencing it for ourselves, meeting and talking to these people who've been egging us on for all these years, right? Like a great marathon race. And what an incredible hope that is, right? But to get to materialism, and I think this is very important, because I'm never going to look at some distant period of time in ancient history and say, there was a golden age. That was how it is, and we've screwed it up ever since. Other than
right before
Adam and Eve.
the whole apple and snake business. Yeah.
That was the golden age, and there was nothing since then, right? But a feeling of nostalgia, good old days, can exist during times that we didn't experience.
Right.
And I respect that, right? I think of the 1950s because of my perception of watching Back to the Future, right? Or Leave It to Beaver, Andy Griffith, right? But we know the 1950s had major problems because of what happened in the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
So obviously you can't just go back in time till it was all better, right? Except to recognize the echo of Eden that exists within all of us. This longing for original innocence. Despite our hereditary original sinfulness, Christ's words are realistic. They don't attempt to make us go back in time. They ask us to experience a purity of heart that is possible even in the state of our hereditary sinfulness. These are words of John Paul II. And the materialism that perhaps we're experiencing in this world, while an ancient heresy at times, I think has been experienced very intensely over the last 300 or 400 years in ways maybe human societies have never experienced on a global scale, right?
Yeah, I would say it is new in that sense. The philosophy, the idea has been around.
Yes.
But I agree with you. I would say, obviously, the last 100 years, we talked about Marxism, but go 200 or 300 years, we've never seen an increase in materialism worldwide like we've seen in the last maybe 300 years.
No, you think about the vulcanization of rubber, the intense, focus on industrialization.
I had no idea you were going to go with the vulcanization of rubber. That was pretty random and cool.
Random and cool. Well,
like
that's significant when it comes to these revolutions that have taken place. Think of America.
Why is it called vulcanization?
I don't fully know, but I imagine based on the root word of volcano, vulcanization is almost this explosion of availability of rubber as well as our ability to use it. Maybe I'm wrong.
Norse god Vulcan, god of the forge, fire, because of the heating of the rubber.
Oh, well, there you go.
I think I'm saying the name right, something like that.
Heating, maybe that's different than exploding. So volcano is this. All right, well, the ability to manipulate rubber as well as other kinds of material in this world. So you have oil and coal and other products.
Yeah.
So we have modern conveniences, all coming from the Industrial Revolution. We have industrial parks now, which to me is kind of an oxymoron. Parks are meant to be peaceful, loving playgrounds, having fun, not shipping boxes and a sad what my brother calls a Lou Goldberg machine of misery, right? You press a button like the old board game Mousetrap, and all of a sudden it does this thing and this thing. So when you order something on Amazon, you're starting the Lou Goldberg machine of misery. Awesome. It's really sad. But to me, I think of the Industrial Revolution as the beginning that kind of took men out of the home. Men and women used to raise their children together on the farm. Was it perfect? Of course not. We were fallen human beings, right? I'm not going to romanticize that. But to take men out of the home and making it seem like we've always, looked at women as just you're the housewife, that may not be very fair to the dynamics that did exist before the Industrial Revolution.
It's like not a team anymore.
Exactly. And then, of course, with, thinking of the people like Sigmund Freud, Margaret Sanger, all of the things that happened during the sexual revolution, taking women out of the home, and there's authentic desires for the feminine genius to be fully expressed and shared in an equal capacity in society. But to look at men and women as competing against each other in this class warfare like Karl Marx pushes becomes almost this sense that women, in order to be equal, have to be identical to men instead of complementarily. There's this complementarity that's not meant to be competitive, but meant to be life-giving, joyful, fruitful, right? To bring human flourishing. And so when the Industrial Revolution gave way to the sexual revolution, what else is there but then the technological revolution? So now we can connect, and in a seemingly convenient way with the internet, social media, right? Remember AOL Instant Messenger, MySpace, Facebook, but then all of a sudden Instagram. Now we have TikTok and Twitter.
It's just mushrooming.
It's crazy to that point where you feel like the only way to connect with a human person is through a phone, through a screen. And in some ways it replaced the human person. So this is where you get the horrible comments on YouTube and Facebook that are anonymous, and because of that you can be harsher, more inhuman, right?
You've got cyberbullying causing people to commit suicide.
Yes.
It's tragic.
Yes, and so that technological revolution, while amazing in many ways, because it gives us the ability to do this. I mean, what incredible technology, what incredible conveniences, what incredible advancements for men and women in society with careers and the ability to make it further than perhaps they did 500, 600 years ago. And yet, we also have to recognize so many of the other pitfalls, the dark places that these same revolutions have opened up for us, so that we can, now having opened Pandora's box, learn how to navigate it.
Because those revolutions have in some sense, while bringing us certain advantages, in other senses have dehumanized us.
Yes.
And this goes back to the very point of what does it mean to be human? And I would suspect that way back at the beginning of today's show, we talked about there has to be a reason for God's timing. Why John Paul II? Why then? We've seen a lot about the errors we can fall into in understanding the human person. But, wow, you want to talk about timing? A couple hundred years into the Industrial Revolution, the technological revolution already there, a man who experienced firsthand the horrors of Nazism and communism, these materialist, philosophies. He had so much personal understanding of what was happening in the world that was destroying our very understanding of what it means to be human. So I would say it's always been important, but I do suspect that
for such a time as this,
it was in a way more important now than ever that
God
this
knew
message
what we
got
needed.
out.
He knew the language that we would need to reach so many people that are longing for answers to the deepest questions of their lives. right? And I think that's a perfect place for us to pause as we conclude our third segment and really getting into the depth of who John Paul II was and how theology of the body is an answer to so many of these cultural revolutions and problems, I think will be the perfect thing to conclude with our fourth segment here at Spirit and Spire. See you soon.
Hey everyone, here at Spirit Spire, we want to serve our community by highlighting God's work in our parishes, schools, and apostolates. We hope to bring renewal and unity between all those in the body of Christ. If you would like a shout out in the next episode of Spirit Spire, go to spiritinspire.com or email us at spiritinspire@gmail.com. Thanks and God bless.
Welcome back, everyone, to Spirit and Spire. This is our fourth and final segment today, a special episode here with my co-host, Isaac Fox. We are discussing that question, what is man? What does it mean to be human? And we've gone through quite a bit, right? Talking initially about St. Thomas Aquinas and that gift of wonder and awe that he experienced, and how he, through both his intellect and his passion, his humanity, helped begin and lay a foundation that would then inform the great John Paul II to develop his theology of the body that would answer these deep questions that surround some of these ancient heresies of Gnosticism, dualism, as well as what we're experiencing very intensely today with materialism. All of these deep questions that have in many ways threatened the dignity of the human person, as well as added so many great conveniences and modern advances. So how do we navigate Pandora's box in such a way that that helps us truly flourish as human beings, to find the kind of society where both men and women complement one another, respect one another, and see one another as God sees? I think that's one of the most important questions that we can try to answer. And this is why I think theology of the body is the antidote, the answer to these deep questions about this culture of rupture, of chaos, confusion, death itself even.
Yeah.
So important. But how do we get there? I think most importantly, you have to look at who John Paul II was as a person. Yeah. Like you alluded to this in the last segment with John, he lived through Nazism and communism, but he lost his whole family before the age of 20 years old. I think his father died when he was 20. And he had his mother die shortly after he was born. I think he was 7, 8, 9 years old. His brother died shortly after that. His sister, I think, died when he was a baby, very young. These tragedies, I think, helped him both experience the love and joy of family life, as well as the detachment, the recognition that maybe he is called to something different. He also did theater. Did you know that?
He wrote several plays.
Yeah, and he memorized many of these plays. Really? He actually had an underground theater that he was a part of called the Rhapsodic Theater, and it was meant
I may have heard of that.
Yeah, it was meant to actually preserve culture, and it was minimalistic theater. So they had small props, things that looked like stuff that would just be in a room where they were having a meeting. So if they, and on occasion they did have an officer, a Nazi officer, barge in on them, they were able to immediately, because they had lookouts, right, go to as if they were just having a meeting about whatever it was that was very secular, non-threatening, so that once the all clear was given, they were able to go back into rehearsing plays like Hamlet and Shakespeare, but more importantly, I think Polish culture, Polish plays, so that they wouldn't lose their heritage.
Sense of place and identity.
Right.
Yeah.
And man, did he press into this poetry, literature.
His poetry is gorgeous. It's so beautiful.
Oh my gosh, he's written such masterpieces.
It's interesting because all popes are humans.
Yes.
But there is something about, and maybe it's partly our knowledge of him and the way he expressed himself, there is something that was certainly a huge part of the popularity of John Paul II that is so human.
Yes.
Because we don't just see him as like a theologian or a church prelate. We see him as the college student. We see him writing plays. We see him acting. We see him writing poetry. We see him
You
as,
know,
as a young
he didn't want to
priest.
be a priest at first. He was actually planning to get married,
Really?
become an actor, you know,
Well, he
do
was
that work.
he was very sensitive to young married couples.
Yes.
He had a very clear understanding and appreciation of romantic love. There was nothing cold about him, not like, okay, well, if you have to do it to increase the human species, go ahead, but I find it disgusting. There was
Right,
none of
no,
that
no.
kind of prudishness there. And you think of him as a young priest and taking people skiing,
Skiing, hiking,
such
canoeing.
a human
Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
just beautiful.
One of my favorite stories is he had a whole bunch of young people with him, young adults, some of his peers, right?
Yeah.
Lifelong friends eventually, on these sroroviskos, right? These places of just gathering, hanging out, spending carefree timelessness together, right? Where they went canoeing one day, and this was under communism, right? And so a communist officer came up and said, "Where are you? What are you here for?" And they told him, and he said, "You can't be here. You have to leave." And so he said, "Okay, we will leave." And so the officer walked off and left, and so they left by putting in their canoes and going down the stream like they planned to do anyway. And at the end of that, he actually flipped the canoe over and celebrated Mass on the canoe in the midst of God's creation with the reverence and beauty and intensity that any Mass should have, right? With what he had before him. So there was also humility and simplicity and sincerity in that. And I think that speaks to his human nature, the normalcy that we're all longing for. He has to be relatable. He has to be fun.
Absolutely.
Right? My gosh, he played ball. He played soccer. He had a nickname, Lolek. I mean, this man was a human person who loved human love.
Yeah.
And he had such a vast experience of it because of his conversations with intimate details with so many of his friends, married couples, engaged couples, dating couples. And so a married couple might be like, well, what are these old white guys in Rome trying to tell me what to do? And it's like, that's not it, right? It's more about the perspective. A married couple, a dating couple, an engaged couple might not have the full perspective because their perspective is limited to the person they're with and the situation they're in. But the church, far from being one particular demographic of people, age, race, thought, creed, is this vast, diverse, organic, living organism of perspective and wisdom, of centuries of teachings, saints, lived experiences. John Paul II had this experience from all of that, as well as his personal encounter with these people he knew and lived and grew up with. So who better to speak to the nature of what it means to be human, how to live a life that brings flourishing and happiness, as well as the beauty and importance and reverence we should have toward human sexuality than John Paul II, who was Karol Wojtyła, right? He was a cardinal, a seemingly obscure cardinal from Poland, who just changed the face of the earth through his openness to God's grace, one step at a time. Did he believe he was going to be Pope? Of course not. He couldn't have known that he would become such a man. But by cooperating with God one step at a time, he knew the times. He knew the tact. He had prudence to where he knew how to face down Nazism and communist ideologies. He spoke directly to that. In fact, when he became Pope...
Incredibly courageous.
Right, yeah.
Never underestimate his courage. He was for all of his kindness, he was a man of incredible strength.
Right? I mean, within a year of becoming Pope, he said, I'm going back home. I want to visit my people because he was from Poland and the communists didn't want him to come. So he was originally going to come for a couple days in May. And the communists said, well, we don't want you to come to that because we don't want to get the people too excited about the, I think, 600th or 700th or 900th anniversary of St. Stanislaus' martyrdom. And so they pushed it off. And so instead of getting a couple days for that, he got 9 days in June to also celebrate Pentecost in the Universal Church, which, boom, when John Paul II said the words, "Come, Holy Spirit," let your spirit descend upon these lands in Poland, it gave birth to the Solidarity movement that overthrew communism itself.
Led directly to the overthrow of communism.
Yes.
You know,
within a few months, he started his Theology of the Body audiences. Isn't that amazing?
I didn't know that. That's interesting. So here's something I was thinking about, and I know, also we have some limited time today. So
sure.
I think like the Theology of the Body, the collection of the audiences, is a very thick book.
Yeah, it's like wading through concrete, as I've perhaps said many times. It is very dense.
So it's
not light reading.
Obviously, as we said a few times today, this is going to go on for many, many episodes. I would like to ask you a question about it, though, in a second, but I did want to share one thought. When we look at the church's teaching, if you can look at it over the course of 2,000 years, there's no new revelation, right? That ended with the death of the last apostle.
Right.
But there is growth, there is blossoming, there is fuller understandings of things. So in one sense, I wouldn't say that John Paul II was new or novel, right? Certainly, when we think of mankind made in the image of God, you probably had people before John Paul II who would see things like the human couple producing offspring as a symbol of the Trinity, right? I'm sure there were ideas already like this before John Paul II. Undoubtedly, the depth to which he went and the importance placed upon the relationship and the body is sort of novel to John Paul II. But if you look back at the church's teaching, I think that history plays a big important role in this.
Yes.
Because if you look back at the early days of the church, we're dealing with paganism. Let's take a passage like, God saying, "Let us make man in our image." Well, the theologians would point out that that image is most clearly expressed in the soul, in the intellect, the part that knows and is conscious, the part of us that is most like God.
Right.
And that is true, number one.
Sure.
But number two, it's also important to emphasize that when you're in pagan cultures, because if not, what's the obvious conclusion? If man was made in God's image, God must have a body, right? So you have to kind of avoid that to some extent. And then another potential risk there is this sort of worshiping of the body, right? Of focusing too much on it. And so you do have this very, very long tendency in the church that's completely accurate, but is really focusing just on the intellectual side of the soul as being the bit of us that's in the image of God. And so there has to be historical reasons for that. And then there's this sudden shift with John Paul II, which is like, let's not forget the whole human person was made in the image of God. So there's something about the body which actually expresses God. It's not just the soul.
Yes.
But the image of God is in some way stamped upon the body. And not just in one individual. There's a communal aspect, because let us make man in our image, male and female he created them. So apparently both are necessary for expressing the divine image. Right?
Yes.
Kind of cool.
Yes.
But what I wanted to ask you, so I was just saying, I think it's interesting to see that historically. It's not in one sense that, well, actually in no sense, is John Paul II repudiating the earlier theologians who would emphasize the soul as being made in the image of God. It's just that it's time for new emphasis, right? So my question for you would be, with this really dense, wading through concrete sort of volume, with all the stuff that's going to come out in that people are still trying to understand. We have people like Christopher West. They're kind of giving us a lens to, filtering that through to us at an easier way to understand. What would you say are like the pillars or building blocks or the most fundamental principles? What are like 3 or 4 big things, big ideas that John Paul II is trying to get at to help us understand the human person?
Oh my goodness, what a magnificent question.
Probably also a long question.
It is a long question, but what you just did, Isaac, was just open up the horizon to this. I mean, I think of us being at the Cathedral of the Assumption.
Yeah.
And, we're called Spirit and Spire. So you think of the imagery that we got with your friend who was the professional drone racer, right?
Yeah.
And all the things of being up in the spire and this desire, even in our logo, right? Which will, over time, we'll have a special Spirit and Spire episode, sure.
Yeah, we'll talk all about how this came to be.
This desire for the Holy Spirit to descend upon the cathedral in a way that shoots out and spreads to all the parishes and offices and people of the Archdiocese to bring that hope and joy.
Right.
What you just did with that question, to me, opened the doors. Opened the doors to the cathedral, opened the doors to the human heart. And it's a new horizon, because the church, as you've said, did focus on the intellect, the soul, the ability to reason, and those being the primary means by which man was made in the image and likeness of God.
And by which man can know God.
And which by man can know God. And then John Paul II calls us to shift, because if you only focus in that direction, you can fall into angelism, right?
Absolutely.
And it's because there's been such a intense rupture between body and soul with original sin, sadly, the fall, that many people, while they applaud and uplift the spirit and the soul, remember that old adage from Scripture, right? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Sure.
So people, while they long for that, have consistently, traditionally, over centuries, fallen into those base behaviors, those dark, addictive feelings and desires and experiences that make us feel less human, less complete. And now we're having these beliefs and tendencies erupt in society where, well, that is all there is.
Right.
That's the materialism falling
Which
in.
is even worse than the falling, because
Yes.
at least when you fall, you have some idea of the heights from which you fell.
Right.
And you may want to climb back up there. But this is even worse, because it says, no, this is really all there is. You just stay here.
Yes. And that's
really sad.
That's a tragedy, right?
Yeah.
John Paul II answered it by looking at the problem that we've been beginning to discuss and saying, I'm not going to go like most philosophers do. All right, here's a problem. I'm going to go step by step until I solve it. All right, we're there. He was more of a spiral or a spire, right? So you
As
can look at
opposed
a
to linear.
spiral staircase going down, or you can look at it going up. And it
Right.
gets deeper and more magnificent every single time. And so it's that spire that John Paul II did. So he revisits themes over and over, and it gets gradual and seemingly repetitive, but not in a way that takes away our ability to get deeper.
Right.
Just like listening to the same talk over and over, you're a different person. You're on a deeper level. You can
And you keep
understand
getting
it
more and more
deeply.
down into the heart of that.
Yes,
Finding
you're
the
getting
center.
into the heart of the meaning behind these profound truths of goodness, beauty, and truth. And so I would say the most important things to think about when it comes to the themes of theology of the body that we'll talk about kind of go back to the text, right?
Right.
JPII was talking about our origin, our history, and our destiny. So original man before the fall, Adam and Eve in the garden, our history, so Christ's words that appeal to the human heart, right, in our historical brokenness, so that we don't just feel broken and fallen like we all know,
Right.
but that we are first and primarily loved,
Yeah.
and shown compassion and uplifted, inspired, invited to answer then the call. And the call is to glory, resurrection,
And that's the destiny.
redemption, and that's the destiny. So origin, history, destiny, that's the first part. The second part then revisits those themes now that we have this, quote, adequate anthropology, and gets into the depth of the human person in their vocation, meaning their lifestyle. And so you start with this idea of covenant and grace. So what is marriage as a covenant and God's grace to help you actually live it out in a mystical, mysterious way. So he looks at that famous passage that many people avoid, Ephesians 5.
Right.
This husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, be subject to your husbands out of reverence for Christ. In other words, wives, let your husbands love you and make those sacrifices. And how do we find that mutual submission, that mutual complementary love, right?
It's interesting because he does actually say in that passage, submit to one another. I think he's maybe talking about the entire church there,
Yes.
but kind of miss that little bit sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the last bits of TOB, which is what theology of the body is. We call it TOB, right? For
Yes,
short.
cool kids call it
Yeah,
TOB.
cool kids, TOB. You get into the depth of the book of Tobit, the Song of Songs, a lot of that imagery. So the connection between agape, sacrificial love, that it was intensely experienced in the book of Tobit, and then that erotic love, the eros, right? This deep passion, this longing for goodness, truth, and beauty that is experienced if you read the Song of Songs, which was sometimes banned literature centuries ago because it was so sensitive.
What's interesting about that is the church has always seen the Song of Songs as being very symbolic of spiritual realities. And there's several interpretations, Christ and the church, the individual soul's union with God, and so forth. Even in Judaism, pre-Christian time, if you ever wonder, like, why is this book in the canon of the Bible?
Right.
They also had similar interpretations. And so, but it is erotic in its language, which makes me think that the erotic side of our nature is also symbolic of a higher spiritual reality.
Yes.
And so it is something that is incredibly special because of that, but it's also something, because it's so special, that runs the risk of being, instead of being
distorted
and hence
twisted, right?
sort of blasphemous, instead of honoring
it
what
it
it's
can
in the image of.
scandalize us. It can shock us if we're not used to it. If people abuse it and neglect it, it can be something that we look at with disdain or fear. And so we have to be very reverent, because these conversations are about guiding us into the Holy of Holies. This is not meant about let's jump right in, because we have to build a foundation. We have to really know our faith backwards and forwards, going back to Genesis, Exodus, some of the details of the Old Testament. How did we get to where Jesus came to begin with, as well as who Jesus was as a child, in his life, his death, his resurrection, his reconciliation, and divine mercy that he showed St. Peter, who, remember, denied him 3 times, all before his ascension into heaven and Pentecost, the birth of the church, and all the things that have happened since then to get to John Paul II. That's the story in a nutshell.
Short little story.
Yeah, short little story, right? And this is why John Paul II wrote Theology of the Body, was to help us discover our story. And obviously he was writing and speaking mostly to theologians, intellects, people who would be able to then take what he was sharing and break it down for decades.
And that process is still going on.
Yeah, it's been 40 years since he started giving these audiences.
The dissemination of TOB is going to keep going on for a long time and full understanding. You mentioned the Holy of Holies, and just 2 little thoughts here real quickly. One is, I think this is something that we cannot emphasize too much, is when we think of laws, rules, and restrictions surrounding human sexuality, those can be there for many reasons. Some, with some people, can be, or certain groups, purely prudishness, right? It could be dualism, right? It could be the body is bad, right? So you put these rules on it. But in the theology of the body, and the church's understanding, is that human sexuality there's something sacred here. It is one of the things that enables us to experience and participate in the creative love of God. And so when you think about, you mentioned the Holy of Holies, there was a curtain there, right? Not just everybody was allowed to walk in and out. And the reason was not because there was something ugly, dirty, or bad in there. It's because...
Or secretive and forbidden. like where you're not
Yeah,
allowed.
it was
but
like,
it's,
this is so sacred. You don't get to tread here lightly. Only somebody very select does. And so I think that is the way that we need to always remember that the church views human sexuality. The rules that surround it are really like a shrine. These are not just a bunch of thou shalt nots because it's something naughty, dirty, gross, bad.
Right.
It's because it is precisely so precious, so beautiful, someplace where we get to participate in the sacredness of creating new human life. My God, that's huge.
Yes.
That is why it gets this walled shrine around it. You mentioned Song of Psalms. My sister is like a walled garden, I think is the line
enclosed
used, right?
garden
Enclosed
is my
garden.
sister and my bride, right?
Yeah,
Powerful language.
Yeah, if your bride was that special to you, you wouldn't just want anybody and everybody to have access,
Right.
or to see this precious thing. So yeah, it's not a negative prescription. It is not just about forbidding. It is designed to set a hedge of protection around something beautiful.
Oh, not a hedge.
Yeah.
A hedge is like this tiny little shrub. Like anything can get over that. We're talking about thick cement walls with razor wire, right? I heard Tim Hawkins,
But
he's a
more
comedian.
Like, I don't know. They're more
It's
like
great.
made out of marble and are beautiful because it's a shrine.
Right. It's not a prison. There's something to reverence.
Yeah.
It's meant to be shown respect and dignity. And so the body is good.
Yeah.
Our sexuality is good. Our maleness and our femaleness is good and beautiful and true. And how do we uplift that, honor that, and show respect to that?
So don't mistreat it. If you have something precious,
Right.
something valuable, you wouldn't throw it around and beat it up and
In
step
fact, John
on it.
Paul II didn't even deliver all of the audiences that are published in the book in Vatican City. Some of those are hidden, more sensitive talks that, again, because of that, emphasizes even more so the nature of how this conversation needs to unfold. Because, John Paul II started with origin, history, destiny. He then gets into the relationship between men and women in the covenant and the sign. He gets into it in the actual sacramental lived experience. So what does it look like with sacrifice and passion? Tobit, Song of Songs. And then finally, his hope is to help people have a renewed perspective over the law of God when it comes to life and family and marriage, so that we don't look at the church's teachings on sex and marriage and love and life as an oppressive list of rules, but as an inheritance, something to long for. It is the lifestyle of happiness I've been searching for my whole life. But it requires changing our opinions, changing behavior, changing lifestyles,
Requires
changing
sacrifice,
beliefs.
fidelity, all kinds of things.
It's very difficult because we're going to Calvary. We're all heading together, holding the hands of mercy. And the hands of mercy are Mother Mary at the foot of the cross and Jesus extending his hand out to hold on to us. At the foot of the cross of our crossroads, of our conversion, of our openness to God's love, our openness to changing our hearts. Like, do we actually believe that God loves us?
Yeah.
Do we actually believe that his plan, his design for us is best for us, is good for us, will actually make us happy, even if we have to let go of some unhealthy, distorted attachments to things that aren't good, right? And that's hard.
Every act of sin, this may be unintentional, but is really saying, if God gave us a rule and then we break it, it's in a way we're saying, I don't think you had my best interest in mind, God, right? Because we think that God is some way trying to prohibit us from being happy, which is nothing to be further from the truth. And I know we're kind of like out of time, but I want to ask you one question, and maybe I'm throwing this to you. It's going to be like a segue too, to lead us into the next time we get to continue this conversation.
Perfect.
You are the theology of the body expert. I have only like this much knowledge on it, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned the importance of looking at origin, history, and destiny, in the way he kind of lays this out. And then in the origin, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think there's also three factors: original solitude, original unity, and original nakedness.
Oh my
goodness. Am I correct
yes.
on that? Okay. So to understand the human person in solitude and in union, to understand our origins, I suspect we're probably going to be looking at some of that stuff in maybe the next episode.
I think our next episode, right? In fact, my hope is with these conversations to not just do a broad conversation, but to do it very slowly, very intentionally.
Solitude. We could discuss that and the implications of that for a very long time.
Yes, and I think there's value in doing that.
Yeah.
For the sake of everyone, all of us, because we're on a journey. In fact, I started a few years ago at recording the Theology of the Body audiences, audience by audience. And all I'm doing is sitting in my church's confessional. Remember St. Luke burned down and the fire started in the confessional?
Yeah.
I look at this as the fire of the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit in this day and age is, to me, most powerfully contained in the beauty and goodness and truth of theology of the body, the way John Paul II articulates it. And so I'm reading those audiences in the confessional, and I'm just sitting there reading the audience out loud on camera. And it can be an audiobook one day, who knows? Yeah. But I have read I think I'm over 90 90 audiences in, and he gave it's essentially 135 audiences over time. Now, it was originally 129 audiences.
2/3 of the way through
and a few of them, by the end of 2024.
And that's going to also deepen your memory and understanding of them just by reading them again.
And I'm releasing them. I'm releasing them on the 40th anniversary of when he delivered that audience. Because I think of 40 years in the desert, and if we want to knock down the walls of Jericho, these walls of not just bureaucracy or parochialism, but even of woundedness and pain, these walls that make our hearts hardened to God's love for us. How can we trust that Joshua is in our midst today? And it's ultimately because of Jesus, who fulfills the Old Testament and all of what they did in the Promised Land.
And Joshua is
the one, right? Joshua is the same. Joshua succeeded Moses. They knocked down the walls of Jericho, conquered the rest of the Promised Land. But the Israelites never fully occupied the Promised Land. And Jesus came to help them see the Promised Land is not just political autonomy or a utopia on earth. The Promised Land is something we're still seeking today within our bodily lived experience by learning how to worship in the temple rightly. And if our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, then it's going to take us decades to fully unravel. This is what it means to be human, to be creatures of longing, searching, seeking, journeying on this grand adventure to discover our story. And so I would love to go audience, like for a single episode, we'll do one audience per segment perhaps and just talk about it.
Sure.
As well as pull themes from Scripture with Genesis, the gifts of the Holy Spirit.
Definitely.
This is Spirit Spire. What better way to do that than looking at our grand story of salvation and using that as a lens by which to view this lens of theology of the body. Because this is a worldview we're trying to understand together. It's going to change the church forever.
Yeah.
Just like René Descartes, Karl Marx, all these characters that we've been discussing have brought a lot of confusion.
And lasting change.
I believe there are powerful, amazing characters like Thomas Aquinas, John Paul II, St. Augustine, so many, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Teresa of Avila, these incredible men and women, Mother Teresa even, who could help us see as God sees, to see the beauty of our humanity in ways that uplift us more than just our souls, but uplift our very bodies. Think of the Cathedral of the Assumption. Mary was lifted body and soul into heaven. Can we get a taste of that, imitate her example by being open and receptive, and then so that we can then become the Saints Peter and Pauls to go evangelize?
Well, John, here's an interesting closing thought for you, since you mentioned St. Thomas. We talked earlier about how St. Thomas is often seen for his intellectual prowess, and that is actually very true. Everything else aside, he was a genius, no doubt, naturally a genius, but also greatly inspired by God. He has given the church such a rich intellectual tradition, And his work has proved invaluable again in modern times in combating atheism, for example, and other philosophies. So we think of him as the intellect guy, the saint of the intellect, perhaps. And John Paul II, now canonized, now a saint, but he had this big emphasis on the body. And I mentioned earlier, was Pope Pius X or whoever it was, around in the 1800s, not so very long ago, calling for a renewed interest in Thomism. And that call has been picked up by a lot of people. It was late 1800s, I believe, and run with. And so it just occurred to me, I find this really interesting that we have this renewed interest in this century right now, heavily in Thomism and the intellectual side of the church, right alongside with John Paul. So you talk to rupture, it's like the intellect and the body have come back together in our times.
And this is why George Weigel calls theology of the body a theological time bomb, set to go off sometime in the 21st century. That's now, everybody. And what will that look like in the future? I know that it's going to be an incredible journey together. And I thank you, Isaac, for being here today with me.
Thank you.
And Bryan and Erik will join us at different episodes if God calls them to it, right? These are kind of our special episodes we record, primarily because not all four of us can be together and we don't have a guest. And we figured, well, what are we going to talk about? I don't know. What is man? What does it mean to be human?
Light subject.
Light subject that'll take our whole lives to really unpack. So I thank you all so much for being here with us in our perhaps lengthy episode, but very special. And I consider it a kickoff to this deep, deep conversation that we're all longing to understand together as we seek to discover our story and begin anew this great adventurous journey that God has all of us on. So God bless you all, and thank you again for joining us on Spirit and Spire. See you next time.